I'd like to now introduce Elena from the University of Melbourne as a PhD student in the Rafferty Lab, which is part of the biosciences area. So over to you. Thanks, Elena. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, Barry, for introducing me. My name is Elena, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here today and speak to you all. Today, I will be talking to you about the research project that I worked on a couple years ago when I lived in the Southern California area in the US. And my project addressed the effects of bushfire smoke and warming climate on native pollinators. And the reason I chose to present this specific project today is because increasing frequency of bushfires is an incredibly relevant problem back in California, and it's also very relevant to Australian context. So I figured it would be an appropriate topic to talk to you about today. Before I dive in, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work, learn, and live, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Greater Kulin Nations, and pay my deep respects to elders, past, present, and future. I also want to acknowledge Kahula Nation and Gabrielina Tongva people, the traditional owners of the land where my research was conducted in Southern California, USA. Just to get us started, why does pollination matter? And considering the audience that I'm talking to today, I'm sure you don't need a reminder that pollinators are important. But just to recap, both in natural and agricultural landscapes, pollinators play a very significant role. In natural landscapes, around 88% of flowering plants rely on animals to pollinate them. Similar situation with agricultural landscapes. Around 75% of our crops globally rely on pollination services. So without pollinators, without the services they provide, we wouldn't be able to maintain the same levels of biodiversity in natural landscapes, and we wouldn't be able to maintain food production at the levels that are required to sustain ever-growing world population. Pollination, very important. Same thing for climate change. I'm sure we can all agree that climate change is a very important issue nowadays, and it's only getting worse day by day, unfortunately. Important aspect of climate change that is often talked about is, of course, the increasing temperatures. By the end of the century, we're expecting to see between 1.2 to 7.2 degrees Celsius increases. And the magnitude of this increase really depends on how much effort we put into stopping climate change. So if we try very hard, we might be seeing smaller increases. If we don't do much, the increase in temperatures will probably be a lot more significant. Another aspect of climate change that is not talked about quite as much is the increasing frequency of bushfires. Bushfires are increasing in frequency all over the world, both in California, where I was conducting this research, as well as in Australia and other parts of the world as well. Not only are they increasing in frequency, the areas that are burning are also getting larger and larger every year. And also, there's a lot more smoke being produced as a result. And this particular aspect of more smoke being produced in bushfires will be very relevant in the rest of my presentation, so keep that in mind. So when I'm thinking about bushfires and pollination, I like to think about it in two parts at two different scales. First, at the local scale, so the direct impacts of burning. Generally, they tend to be quite positive. So soon after burning, plants tend to resprout with a lot of vigor. They tend to produce more flowers and, as a result, attract more pollinators, which leads to increased diversity of both plants and pollinators in the area. So, positive impacts overall. Although burning can also have some negative effects on pollinators, mostly in terms of their ability to navigate and communication, which can be impaired by presence of smoke as well as heat from the fire. But that's on the local impacts, and those are a lot better studied. There's a lot of studies that have been done on the direct impacts of burning on plants and pollinators. However, if we zoom out a little bit and think about the landscape level impacts of bushfires, here we will be talking more about the fire weather. And fire weather implies warmer temperatures because bushfires are a lot more likely to occur on the hottest days of the year. We're also talking about less sunlight. And That is because of the presence of the smoke in the atmosphere during a large-scale bushfire event. And that smoke will be reflecting a large portion of incoming sunlight back into space, letting through a much smaller portion of sunlight. And that will definitely have an impact on plants because obviously plants need sunlight to photosynthesize, and without sunlight, they can't do that very well. That lack of sunlight might also impair bees and their activity. We don't know much about those effects. However, we can predict that bees might struggle to navigate because they tend to use sunlight as the navigation target for them. They also might not forage as much because, as you all probably know, bees tend to forage a lot less on cloudy days, and the presence of smoke kind of creates a similar effect to a cloudy day. So, all that being said, the part that we still don't know, and the question that I was asking when working on this project, was what is the combined effect of warmer climate and bushfires on pollination? Basically, as time goes on and the climate gets warmer and warmer, temperatures continue to increase, and as bushfires happen more often and emit more smoke into the atmosphere, reducing the amount of sunlight entering and reaching the surface of the earth, when two of those factors occur at the same time, what can we expect will happen to pollination? So, to the interactions between bees and the flowers they pollinate. So, to try to answer this question, we conducted a greenhouse experiment. We set up three different greenhouse rooms with different conditions. So, in the first greenhouse room, we established ambient conditions. And those conditions were just typical for the area where our research was being conducted. We did not alter the temperature or the sunlight in any way for that specific room. In the second room, and we called it warmed, we slightly increased the temperature. And that was to imitate the conditions that we might expect to see as climate warms, but not too far in the future, so in the very near future. And then finally, in the third room, we called it the hot and shaded room. In this room, the temperature was even hotter, so it was 2 degrees Celsius above the ambient. And we also deployed a shade at the top of the room, which was filtering sunlight, reducing the amount of sunlight entering the room. And this room is supposed to imitate the conditions that we might expect to see towards the end of the century as climate becomes much hotter and bushfires happen a lot more frequently, reducing the amount of sunlight entering the atmosphere. So, in each of those greenhouse rooms, we had identical setup. So, in each of the rooms, we placed 6 mesh cages. In each of the cages, we had several individuals of 3 different plant species, and we also placed 6 female bees in each of the cages. And we were using Osmia lignaria bees. In this experiment, it's a blue orchard bee. You probably are familiar with it. They're commonly used as as a pollinators in agriculture as well. In California, I'm not sure about here, but definitely in California, they're used in agriculture. Along with plants and bees, we also placed nesting blocks in each of the cages. Those were, you can see here on the central picture. It's this little wooden house with paper straws inside of it that bees were able to use for nesting to lay their eggs and rear their offspring in. So once we placed plants and the bees into the cages, we closed them off and we did not interfere with them for the rest of the experiment, which lasted for about 6 weeks. All we did was observe the activity that was happening inside of the cages. And here in the center, you're able to see the video of the type of activity that we were observing. So we're basically looking at bees foraging. We were recording what flowers they chose to forage on. We recorded, because we had 3 different flower species, so we're recording the choice the bees were making in terms of which flowers they wanted to forage on. We recorded how much time the bees would spend on each flower, and we also recorded how many flowers they were visiting per minute. So basically, how fast they were. At the end of this all, we collected all our data, we analyzed it, and we got quite interesting results, which I'm gonna share with you right now. And just to preface before I dive into the results, I will show you a few plots but I'm not going to focus too much on the plots themselves. Instead, I will try to focus more on the real life, real world implications of our findings. So bear with me while I show you the boring plots, and then we'll talk about the more important stuff. So first of all, I'll start with plants. So the effects of our treatments on the plants first. So at the top plot here, we are looking at the number of flowers produced by plants in the three of our greenhouse rooms. And you can tell that in the hot and shaded room, so the room where conditions were imitating hotter climate and more bushfire smoke, so less sunlight, in that room, the purple line, the plants produced significantly less flowers. And then at the bottom plot here, you can see that in the hot and shaded room, the flowers also produced a lot less nectar. So almost 50% less nectar than in other rooms. So significant difference. But what does it mean for the real life predictions? So what will happen to plants in a warmer climate with more frequent bushfires? Well, first of all, plants will produce fewer flowers. In addition to that, flowers will also produce less nectar. And two of those things mean that there's going to be a lot less food for bees, which is not great news. This is not good for bees. They need the calories, they need the energy to be able to effectively deliver pollination services to the plants. Moving on to the bees, what happened to them in our treatments? Well, on the top plot here, we are looking at the number of flowers bees were able to visit per minute. So basically, how fast did they move between the flowers? And we found that in the hot and shaded treatment, bees were a lot slower. They were not able to visit quite as many flowers per minute as they were able in the two other treatments. And then at the bottom here, we are looking at the handling time. Handling time is the amount of time bees spend on the flower itself, so foraging or sitting on the flower. And we found that in the hot and shaded treatment, bees spent a lot more time sitting on the flowers instead of flying between them. So what does it mean will happen to bees in a warmer climate and more frequent bushfires? So how do these findings translate to real life predictions? Well, as you can remember from the previous slide, we established that bees will have a lot less food available to them because plants will be producing less flowers and less nectar. So because bees will have less food available to them, they won't have quite as much energy to fly around. And because of that, we are likely to see bees to become a lot slower, so they won't be visiting quite as many flowers per minute. They will also be spending a lot more time just sitting on flowers instead of flying between them. And the second part is mostly because either they just won't have enough energy, so they will need to sit on flowers and rest and recover, or because there's going to be so much less nectar in the flowers, the bees will just need a lot more time to extract whatever small amounts of nectar there is in flowers. They just going to need more time to extract it. Hence, they will spend more time on flowers. Another cool, interesting results that we found in our study was that compared to the ambient conditions, so the normal conditions that we have nowadays, normal temperatures, normal amounts of sunlight, compared to that, in the future, with warmer climate, more bushfires, and less sunlight, we can expect the bees to become a lot less picky. So nowadays, in normal conditions, bees tend to show preference for specific flower species. In the stressful conditions that are warmer and less sunlight, bees stop caring too much about which flowers they forage on. They just take whatever they have available to them. And that is probably because in the stressful conditions, bees have a lot less resources available to them, a lot less flowers, a lot less nectar. So they're just willing to take whatever there is. They can't afford to be picky. And that is not great for pollination services they're providing because we usually want bees to forage on specific species of flowers and transfer pollen between the individuals of the same species so they can reproduce. And if bees visit all the different flowers, all the different species, the pollination won't occur. Now that I've covered all those different results, what can we really expect to happen in the climate that is warmer and with more frequent bushfires emitting more smoke and reducing sunlight? Well, we can expect that plants will produce less food for bees. And as a result, bees will be getting less nutrition and they will be a lot slower. They will also spend a lot more time on the flowers trying to extract nectar. They will visit less flowers and receive less nutrition. As a result, they probably won't be able to provide quite as much support to their offspring, to their babies, which is not great news because that means that the populations of bees are likely to be negatively impacted as a result. Similarly, because bees will be slower, they will be visiting a lot less flowers, so less flowers will receive pollination services from the bees. And that's not great for flowers either, because that will probably lead to reductions in plant populations as well. So, not great outcomes for either plants or bees. And these findings just really highlight the importance for us to try to stop climate change to the extent that we can, to reduce the warming of the climate, and to manage the bushfires, to prevent increases in frequency and scale as much as we can, because if we don't, it's probably gonna lead to very negative consequences for both plants and bees and their interactions in the future. That is all from me today. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I want to thank all the people that helped me with this project. You can see their names here on the screen. There's also my contact info here. Definitely, if you have any questions afterwards, shoot me a quick email. I'm very happy to talk more about my research with you, and I'm happy to take any questions now as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Elena. Michael?
Thank you very much for that, Elena. Based on what you've said, in effect, you're saying that bees, for example, in Queensland, which has a higher temperature, at least more than 1 or 2 degrees difference with the state of Victoria, is that bees up there don't work as well as bees down here?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. Well, it really depends on the species of bees that we're talking about because different species are adapted to very different conditions. For example, I can give you an example of bees in Tasmania, which, it's a lot colder than even Victoria. There are a lot of bumblebees there because bumblebees are adapted to colder temperatures. They can withstand colder temperatures. Towards the north of Australia, there's lots of carpenter bees. They're usually more adapted to tropical conditions, so much hotter conditions. So really depending on whatever conditions the specific species is adapted to, that's the conditions they're gonna do the best in. So you don't want to put them in the conditions that differ too much, either too hot or too cold. So they perform better in whatever temperatures they're adapted to. So in Queensland, species that occur there, they are adapted to the temperatures that are characteristic for Queensland, and they're going to perform the best in those conditions as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So in your scenario, that the bee that you are using in California, is that the predominant species that is used for pollinators and for hobby and commercial beekeepers, or is it the European honeybee? And if it was the European honeybee, why the research wasn't conducted on the European honeybee?
Again, great question. Yes, so the blue orchard bees, the Osmia lignaria, the ones we used for this research, they are native to the area, to Southern California. That was the main reason we chose them because we were curious specifically in terms of how this factors will impact native bee populations, and those bees are very common in Southern California. They also are used for agriculture, especially almond production. They pollinate almond trees. The reason we chose not to focus on honeybees is because honeybee behavior is much better studied. We know so much more about honeybees than we do about any other bee species. And so there's really lack of knowledge on native bee species. So the more we're able to study native bees, the better. Also, you all are probably very well familiar with, the issues that honeybee populations are facing nowadays, including varroa mites and many other problems. So a lot of farmers are looking to start replacing their honeybee colonies with some other native bees that might be just as efficient at pollinating. So conducting studies on native bees is very useful for us because by learning more about their needs and their responses to different conditions, we can start trying to understand whether we can effectively use them for agricultural pollination as well.
Thank you.
Jamie?
Thanks, Elena. I'm not familiar with the orchard bee. You mentioned probably a loss in nutrition. So with the bee during your study, did you notice in those hotter temperatures, etc., were there, I suppose, any reduction in reproduction, like population? And then secondly, I assume they're going to have an uncapped stage. Did they require more sort of resources or bees doing work to keep them alive so they didn't dry out, that sort of thing during that component as well?
Yes, so to answer your first question, yes, I didn't have enough time to show you all the results, but we did assess the reproduction as well. And we did find that in the most extreme conditions, like the hottest and the least sunlight conditions, they did produce significantly less offspring. So definitely we can expect to see issues with reproduction if we get to the point of similar conditions in the future. I'm not sure I fully understood your second question. You were asking about the resources they need during a specific life stage. What life stage are you referring to?
Say with peak summer during European bees, for what I observe, there's a lot more bees required to keep the hive at the right temperature for the brood to go through its stages. So I guess, was there more resources as far as bees required to keep whatever brood and that alive, that sort of thing?
Yes, I see. So I guess an important thing to mention here is that these bees, the blue orchard bees, they're not social, they're solitary. So each individual female makes its own nest and takes care of its own nest. So we didn't observe any, colony dynamics in this case because the species are not social. But in terms of, foraging effort, we would definitely see a lot more foraging during the time period preceding nesting by the females. And then once they nested and finished up their nests and closed off their nests, they pretty much completely stopped foraging because they did not need to supply any more nutrition for the larvae. So yeah, we definitely saw that change in the foraging behavior across the time of the experiment.
Elena, thanks very much for a really interesting talk there. I'm going to change the subject a bit to smokers. There's a common view that smokers work because the bees think that there's a forest fire and are packing the honey ready to disappear in a more safe area. It seems equally plausible to me that the reason smokers work is because the bees are disoriented by the smoke. Do you have any view of that?
Great question. Honestly, I don't know too much about the direct chemical effects of smoke on the bees because we were looking more on the effects of reduced sunlight. However, yes, I have read papers about how smoke can impact bees. And as you said, it's very likely related to their ability to navigate. So because they use sunlight to tell where up and down is, they also communicate each other through chemicals. Like they release certain chemicals that allow them to communicate messages to each other. So when air is saturated with smoke, that chemical communication is hindered, and that's probably not a good experience for them. So maybe that's why they're trying to get away from it as well. So, but yeah, I'm not an expert on that, unfortunately.
Thanks, Elena.
And thanks, Bob, for the question. So look, I think we'll close the discussion on that. It's been a very interesting presentation, Elena, and it's generated a lot of interesting questions. So
thank you so much
very much.